Constantine, the man who killed the old gods and crowned Christ. Part 1. The Twilight of the Ancient Gods. When the gods stopped speaking. The dying empire was full of rituals and omens, but the old gods no longer spoke. In the dark temples of Diocletian's age, priests bent over bowls of blood, cutting open the entrails of oxen, searching for signs of reassurance within steaming flesh, and finding nothing. The augurs looked into the viscera and saw emptiness. The haruspices, those ancient diviners who had once guided Roman generals to victory, now whispered uncertainties to nervous magistrates. The empire that had once conquered the world could no longer read the will of the old gods who had made it great. The year was 303 AD, and Rome had already lived for over 1,000 years. Its legions had marched from the rain-soaked forests of Britain to the burning sands of Mesopotamia. Its language had become the tongue of law, literature, and power across 3 continents. Its roads connected cities that had never known connection. Its aqueducts brought water to 1 million souls in a single city. Rome was not merely an empire, it was civilization itself, the organizing principle of the known world. Yet beneath this veneer of eternal grandeur, the foundation was cracking. The crisis had been building for decades, perhaps centuries. The Pax Romana, that golden age of peace and prosperity under the early emperors, had ended in blood and chaos. The 3rd century had witnessed what historians would call the imperial crisis, 50 years of civil war, plague, economic collapse, and barbarian invasion. In those 5 terrible decades, more than 50 men claimed the purple of imperial power. Most died violently within months. The Senate became a theater of fear. The provinces learned to expect not protection, but plunder from the armies meant to defend them. Diocletian had tried to repair Rome through division. The Tetrarchy, 4 emperors ruling 4 corners, was supposed to restore order through balance, to distribute the impossible burden of governing a fractured world. Instead, it multiplied chaos. Each emperor commanded his own court, his own army, his own ambitions. They were meant to cooperate. They prepared to compete. Inflation strangled cities as each tetrarch debased the currency to pay his legions. Armies rebelled against their own generals, or worse, followed them into treason. The peace Rome promised had become a ghost, haunting its own monuments. And so, in a final desperate gesture of devotion to the old ways, the empire turned to violence against its own conscience. The Great Persecution began on February 23, 303 AD, when Diocletian ordered the destruction of the church at Nicaea, visible from his own palace windows. It was a symbolic execution, the demolition of a building that represented everything the empire once despised. Christians had been growing in number and influence for decades, despite periodic waves of violence. They refused to sacrifice to the emperor's genius, the divine spirit that legitimized Roman power. They spoke of a kingdom, not of this world, which sounded to Roman ears like treason wrapped in theology. The persecution that followed was methodical and merciless. Imperial edicts commanded the burning of scripture, the arrest of clergy, the forced sacrifice of believers. Those who refused were tortured with escalating creativity, racked, burned, beheaded, thrown to beasts in the arena, crucified in mockery of their God. In North Africa, entire congregations were locked in their churches and burned alive. In Egypt, martyrs were so numerous that the church later dated its calendar from the era of martyrs. Thousands of Christians, poor, unarmed, unbending, were hunted through the empire's cities like animals. Parchments of scripture were burned with the same solemnity once given to the burial of kings. The air in Rome's streets smelled of incense and ash and fear, a toxic mixture of pagan piety and Christian defiance. Yet the persecution failed. It failed because faith, as it turned out, could not be killed by fire. The empire's magistrates believed terror could exterminate belief, that sufficient cruelty would break the human spirit. They were wrong. The Christians sang hymns as they burned. They prayed for their executioners. They went to death with such serenity that even the torturers began to wonder what they knew that Rome did not. Into this fractured, violent, spiritually exhausted age was born the man who would transform it utterly. Constantine, son of a Western general, educated by the East, raised among enemies, and quietly watching the old world crumble. A prince among enemies. Constantine's childhood was a study in contradiction, a training ground for the paradoxes he would later embody as emperor. He was born around 272 AD in Naissus, a frontier town in the province of Moesia Superior, modern-day Serbia. His father, Constantius Chlorus, was a military officer rising through the ranks of a system that rewarded competence with survival. His mother, Helena, was of humble origin, perhaps an innkeeper's daughter, perhaps a stable girl. The sources disagree, but all concur that she was not aristocratic. Their union was likely a concubinage rather than a legal marriage, which meant Constantine's legitimacy was always questionable, always something to be proven by achievement rather than inherited by right. This ambiguity would mark him. He was nobly born, but not quite noble, connected to power, but not secure in it, always an outsider, looking in at the empire's inner sanctum. When Diocletian established the Tetrarchy in 293 AD, Constantius became Caesar of the West, junior emperor under Maximian. As part of the political reorganization, he was required to set aside Helena and marry Theodora, Maximian's stepdaughter. This was standard imperial practice: marriage as alliance, family as hostage exchange. Young Constantine was sent east to the court of Galerius, the Caesar of the East, officially as a guest of honor, secretly as insurance against his father's ambitions. He spent his formative years as a hostage prince in Nicaea, Galerius's eastern capital. These were not comfortable years. Galerius was a brutal man, a peasant soldier who had risen through violence and retained its habits. He despised Christians with the fervor of a true believer in the old gods, and he despised Constantine with the suspicion of a man who sees a future rival in a young hostage's eyes. But Constantine observed everything. He was educated in Greek rhetoric and philosophy, trained in military tactics, and exposed to the cosmopolitan sophistication of the East. He learned languages, studied maps, practiced with weapons, and watched the mechanisms of power from the privileged perspective of one who is close to it but not yet wielded by it. He saw power rot behind purple robes. He watched Diocletian, once a vigorous reformer, become consumed by ceremony and distance, transforming the emperor from first citizen to distant deity. He observed courtiers maneuver, generals plot, and bureaucrats extract wealth from provinces until they bled. He learned that loyalty was a commodity sold to the highest bidder, that fear was more reliable than love, and that survival required the ability to read men as augurs read entrails. And he saw faith tested under torturers' hands. Nicaea was the epicenter of the Great Persecution. From the palace windows, Constantine could see the church burning. In the streets below, He witnessed Christians dragged to trial, given the choice between incense and death. He watched them choose death. He saw families torn apart, saw old men beaten until bones broke, saw young women face degradation and torture rather than renounce their invisible God. The empire's magistrates believed terror could exterminate belief. But Constantine, watching the Christian prisoners sing as they burned, understood something else. That conviction could outlast cruelty. That faith, paradoxically, grew stronger under persecution. That the empire was spending its authority destroying people who would have been its most loyal subjects. It was a lesson in the economics of power that Rome's rulers had forgotten. You cannot govern only by force. Legitimacy requires belief, and belief cannot be manufactured by decree. When his father, Constantius, summoned him back to the west in 305 AD, the recall was refused. Galerius intended to keep the young heir as insurance. Constantius was aging, his health failing, and his portion of the empire was the least wealthy and most threatened by barbarian incursions. Galerius calculated that Constantine was more valuable as a hostage than as an heir. But Constantine did not wait for permission. He had learned in Galerius's court that permission was what weak men waited for. One night, he fled. The escape was worthy of legend. Riding until dawn, he cut the hamstrings of every imperial post-horse behind him so no one could follow. It was an act of desperate genius, the first of many that would characterize his rise to power. The imperial messenger system, the cursus publicus, was Rome's communication backbone, a network of relay stations that allowed messages and officials to cross the empire at unprecedented speed. By crippling it behind him, Constantine bought time measured in days, and days could mean survival. Across Europe he raced, through the shattered provinces of the empire, toward Britain and freedom, through Illyricum and Italy, through Gaul with its crumbling cities and restive tribes, through the narrow crossing to Britain, where his father held court in Eboracum. The empire's future, riding through the night, chased by the ghosts of its gods and the agents of its present rulers. It was a flight, yes, but also a declaration that he would no longer be anyone's hostage, that he would seize his fate rather than wait for it to be bestowed, that the old rules of the tetrarchy were already dead, even if no one else knew it yet. Part 2. The Road to Power. The Proclamation in the Mist. In the mists of Britain, Constantius ruled his small portion of the empire from Eboracum, the Roman name for York, a northern garrison town that had become an imperial capital by accident of war and logistics. Britain in 306 AD was Rome's most remote province, cold and profitable and perpetually threatened. Beyond Hadrian's Wall lay the Picts, painted warriors who raided with seasonal regularity. The legions stationed in Britain were tough, pragmatic, and loyal primarily to their own survival. They had seen emperors rise and fall with the regularity of seasons. They respected strength and distrusted Rome's increasingly Byzantine political arrangements. Constantius was a good soldier and a decent administrator, which made him rare among the tetrarchs. He had secured the Rhine frontier, reconquered Britain after a rebellion, and governed with moderation. His soldiers loved him because he shared their hardships and paid them on time, two increasingly rare imperial qualities. But his health was failing. The campaigns had worn him down. The northern climate, with its perpetual damp and grey, had settled into his lungs. When Constantine arrived, exhausted from his flight across Europe, he found his father preparing for one final campaign against the Picts. It was as much ritual as military necessity, a dying emperor proving he could still lead. Father and son rode north together, and in the summer of 306 AD, somewhere near the wall that divided civilization from wilderness, Constantius Chlorus died. The army was waiting. The soldiers, worn from decades of chaos and emperors who demanded their loyalty and then betrayed it, turned to the son. They had loved Constantius, and they saw in Constantine his father's strength, combined with something else: ambition, intelligence, the hunger of youth. They raised Constantine on their shields in the ancient Germanic manner that had become a Roman tradition. The eagles shined again briefly in the grey northern light, and the chant began, "Augustus, Augustus." It was treason, glorious, unstoppable treason. The Tetrarchy had not provided for hereditary succession. Emperors were supposed to be chosen by merit and adoption, not birth. Across the empire, 3 other emperors ruled legally under Diocletian's carefully constructed system. Constantine was now a usurper in the most unstable political system Rome had ever known. But Constantine understood what Diocletian had not: that soldiers followed men, not systems; that legitimacy was created by victory, not by constitutional arrangement; that the Tetrarchy was already dead, it simply hadn't finished collapsing yet. To survive meant war. But war against whom? And in what order? Forging power in blood and iron. Constantine began by securing the frontier on the Rhine. The Frankish tribes had been raiding with impunity, testing Rome's weakened borders. Constantine responded with the brutal efficiency that would characterize his military career. He crossed the Rhine in winter, when the barbarians expected Roman armies to be in winter quarters. Fire and steel carved his authority into the north. Entire villages were destroyed. Prisoners were thrown to beasts in amphitheaters as public lesson. Cities that had doubted him learned to salute quickly. Yet even amid brutality, he reorganized the soldiers, repaired bridges, rebuilt supply routes, reformed the tax system to actually collect revenue. His rule was not only by conquest, but by competence, the rarest Roman virtue by then. For the next 6 years, Constantine ruled Gaul and Britain, while the Tetrarchy consumed itself in civil war elsewhere. Galerius, furious at the usurpation, recognized Constantine as Caesar, junior emperor, rather than Augustus, a deliberate insult. Constantine accepted the compromise. He was young. He could wait. While his rivals fought each other for primacy, he built strength. He watched as Maxentius, the son of the retired Emperor Maximian, seized Rome in 306 AD, proclaiming himself the defender of the Senate and the old Roman traditions. He watched as Galerius's attempt to dislodge Maxentius failed catastrophically. He watched as new usurpers rose and fell like waves breaking against rocks, and he prepared. Constantine understood that Rome herself was the ultimate prize. Whoever controlled the ancient capital controlled legitimacy itself. Maxentius had Rome, but Constantine believed Maxentius had mistaken the shadow for the substance. Rome was a symbol, yes, but symbols can be moved. What mattered was power: military, economic, political. By 312 AD, the stage was set. Constantine controlled the wealthy provinces of Gaul, Britain, and Spain. Maxentius held Italy and North Africa. Between them lay the Alps and history, the impossible campaign. The road from Gaul to Rome became a test of destiny. Constantine moved his troops with unearthly speed, a blitz of legions and faith that caught Maxentius unprepared. He crossed the Alps in early spring, through passes still choked with snow, and descended into Italy like an avalanche. City after city opened its gates: Segusio, Turin, Milan. Some resisted and were destroyed as examples. Most chose survival over loyalty to Maxentius. The speed of the campaign was intentional. Constantine understood that in civil war, momentum is everything. An army that seems unstoppable becomes unstoppable because no one wants to be the fool who stands against fate. He marched his legions, pushed his supply lines to the breaking point, and kept moving before Maxentius could organize effective resistance. Maxentius, secure in Rome, made a catastrophic miscalculation. Instead of using Rome's ancient walls and his superior numbers to wait out Constantine in a siege, he decided to meet him in open battle. Perhaps he feared losing legitimacy by appearing cowardly. Perhaps he believed his own propaganda about divine favor. Perhaps he was simply not a good general. On October 28, 312 AD, the two armies faced each other across the Tiber at the Milvian Bridge, just north of Rome. And on the eve of that battle, something happened that no historian can explain, though all record it. Constantine saw a sign in the sky, the cross of fire. The sources disagree on every detail except that something occurred. Eusebius, Constantine's court bishop and biographer, claims Constantine told him personally that he saw a cross of light above the sun, accompanied by the words, "In this sign, conquer," in hoc signo vinces, in Latin, and tutoi nika in Greek. That night, Christ supposedly appeared to Constantine in a dream and commanded him to place the heavenly sign on his soldiers' shields. Lactantius, writing closer to the event, describes only the dream, not the daytime vision. He says Constantine was commanded to mark the shields with the heavenly sign of God, the Chi-Rho, the first two letters of Christ's name in Greek, formed into a symbol that looked like a P crossed with an X. Later, sources add embellishments: that the entire army saw the cross, that the words appeared in Latin and Greek simultaneously, that the sun itself testified to Christ's power. Was it a dream? Was it the shimmering halo of the setting sun, refracting through moisture in the air, seen by an exhausted commander and interpreted through the lens of his anxieties? Was it a solar halo, a natural atmospheric phenomenon that appears as a ring or cross of light around the sun? Was it calculation by a shrewd ruler who sensed the age's turning tide and understood that his army needed a unifying symbol more powerful than the old eagles? We cannot know. What we know is that Constantine claimed the heavens had spoken, not through entrails and omens, the old language of Roman divination, but through light and words, the new language of Christian revelation. And in that moment, whether revelation or calculation, whether divine intervention or political genius, the empire's 1,000 gods began to die. He ordered the Chi-Rho painted on every shield. He had the symbol affixed to a new standard, the labarum, a military banner that would become the most recognizable symbol in Christendom. Gold and jewels adorned it. Constantine's genius for spectacle, transforming religious symbol into military theater. To the old guard, veterans who had sacrificed to Jupiter and Mars before every battle, it was blasphemous and terrifying. To his soldiers, most of whom were neither devout pagans nor committed Christians, but simply men who wanted to survive and prosper, it was mystery, and mystery has its own power. To Constantine, it was strategy and salvation intertwined, the unification of heaven and earth in a single military emblem. The next day, they faced Maxentius across the Tiber at the Milvian Bridge. Blood in the Tiber. The Tiber runs through Rome like an artery, and in 312 AD, the Milvian Bridge was one of the few crossings that could support an army. Maxentius had built a pontoon bridge next to the ancient stone structure to allow his larger forces to deploy efficiently. It was a strategic error, compounded by tactical incompetence. Constantine's army was smaller but more experienced, hardened by the Rhine campaigns and united by momentum. Maxentius's troops were larger but demoralized, conscripted from Italian cities that resented his rule, led by generals who saw defeat approaching like a thunderstorm. The battle opened with Constantine's cavalry smashing into Maxentius's flanks. The Chi-Rho gleamed on shields and standards. Whether the soldiers believed in the Christian God or not, they believed in Constantine's certainty, and in war, belief is its own weapon. Maxentius's lines held initially, but Constantine had positioned his forces brilliantly, using the river as an anvil against which to hammer the enemy. As the center of Maxentius's army retreated toward the bridge, the retreat became a rout. The pontoon bridge, hastily constructed, collapsed under the weight of fleeing soldiers. Men in armor sank like stones. The Tiber ran red. Maxentius himself, trying to retreat across the stone bridge, was pushed into the water by the press of his own fleeing army. The weight of his imperial armor dragged him down. He drowned in sight of the city he claimed to defend, killed not by Constantine's sword, but by the panic of his own men. When Constantine's soldiers pulled the body from the river the next day, they cut off the head and paraded it through Rome on a spear. It was brutal, traditional, and effective. The city that had once conquered the world watched as its fate was decided in the river's shadow, watched as one more emperor died violently, watched as the victor entered in triumph. But this triumph was different. When Constantine entered Rome on October 29th, 312 AD, he did not go to the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill, where every emperor since Augustus had sacrificed in thanksgiving. He refused to perform the ancient rituals that legitimized Roman power. He did not climb to the Capitol to be crowned with the civic crown. He did not make the traditional offerings to Mars, patron of Roman military might. Instead, he rode slowly through streets still lined with shattered statues and burning altars, accepting the Senate's submission and the people's cheers, and then he retired to the palace. Rome welcomed its new master with the wary gratitude of a city that had survived too many masters. But this time, the triumph smelled of incense unfamiliar to its ancient stones. The old gods had been refused their due. A new power had been acknowledged, however ambiguously. The great turning had begun, the old gods were dying, and Christ was rising in their place. Part 3. The Christian Emperor. Freedom for the faithful. The empire waited to see whether this Christian emperor was myth or man, whether his conversion was genuine faith or merely political calculation. Constantine gave them their answer gradually, carefully, with the skill of a man who understood that revolution succeeds when it appears inevitable rather than radical. In February 313 AD, Constantine met with Licinius, the Eastern emperor who had become his ally through marriage to Constantine's half-sister. Together they issued what history calls the Edict of Milan, though it was not technically an edict and may not have been issued in Milan. Details matter less than substance, and the substance was revolutionary. The decree declared freedom of worship across the empire, ending 3 centuries of legal persecution. Where Diocletian had outlawed belief, Constantine legalized the conscience. Christians were free to practice their faith openly. Their property, confiscated during the persecutions, would be returned. Churches could own land, collect donations, operate without imperial harassment. But the edict went further. It proclaimed religious tolerance for all faiths: Christian, pagan, Jewish, Persian, Egyptian, whatever local gods the provinces venerated. This was not simply tolerance of Christianity, it was a fundamental restructuring of the relationship between state and belief. The language was carefully neutral, even bland. We grant both to Christians and to all others free facility to follow the religion which each one may desire. But beneath the bureaucratic prose lay a theological revolution. The emperor was declaring that divine favor came not from correct ritual, but from freedom of conscience, that the state's legitimacy did not depend on enforcing correct worship. This was more than mercy. It was mathematics. Constantine understood what the persecutors had not, that the church was the only institution in the crumbling empire that still functioned with discipline, efficiency, and international scope. Where imperial bureaucracy had collapsed into corruption and incompetence, where provincial governors extracted wealth and provided nothing in return, where the army was more threat than protection, the church endured. Bishops governed congregations that crossed class boundaries. Priests ran charities that fed widows and orphans. Deacons managed finances with more honesty than tax collectors. The church had martyrs who willingly died for their faith, while the empire had only soldiers who needed constant bribes to fight for theirs. Faith was not a weakness to be suppressed. It was infrastructure to be utilized. Imperial gold, sacred stone. Constantine began channeling imperial resources toward the church with the enthusiasm of a man who had discovered an undervalued asset. He returned confiscated church property, not as compensation, but as investment. He exempted clergy from the heavy burden of municipal liturgies, the ruinous obligation to fund public works from personal wealth that was bankrupting the empire's middle class. He granted bishops legal jurisdiction over civil cases when both parties consented, essentially creating a parallel court system that was faster and less corrupt than imperial justice. He funded the construction of magnificent basilicas on lands where pagan temples had stood for centuries. In Rome, he commissioned the Lateran Basilica, the first purpose-built Christian church in the empire's capital, on land confiscated from the imperial horse guard. It was a statement in architecture. The emperor's military might would now serve a higher power. At the site where Peter was believed to have been martyred, Constantine began construction of Old St. Peter's Basilica, a building so vast it would take decades to complete. Where Christians had worshipped in secrecy, they would now pray in splendor, funded by the state that had once hunted them. In the Holy Land, Constantine's mother, Helena, now Augusta, Empress Dowager, made a pilgrimage to Jerusalem and initiated the construction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre over what was believed to be Christ's tomb. Imperial gold transformed the geography of faith, marking sacred sites with monuments that would endure for centuries. Bishops who once hid in catacombs now entered palaces wearing silk. The same empire that had imprisoned the apostles now paid for their memorials in marble. Christ, once the crucified rebel whose followers were thrown to beasts for entertainment, now marched behind the eagles. This was Constantine's true talent, not belief alone, but balance. He could speak to Christians as their deliverer, quoting scripture and consulting bishops, while simultaneously maintaining pagan symbols on his coinage and retaining the title Pontifex Maximus, supreme priest of Rome's traditional religion. He was Christian enough to inspire believers and pagan enough not to terrify traditionalists. For a moment, perhaps a decade, the two faiths lived uneasily beside one another, the old and the new sharing the same sunlight, as if both worlds sensed that one was dying and the other only half-born, but neither ready to acknowledge the inevitable. The emperor's two faces. But Constantine's Christianity was never merely personal piety. It was policy, carefully calibrated to the needs of empire. He understood that the Church offered what Rome desperately needed: unity. The empire was fracturing along every fault line: linguistic, ethnic, economic, regional. Greek East and Latin West were drifting apart. Provinces identified more with local gods than with Jupiter. The old civic religion of Rome, which had bound the empire together through shared ritual, was dying not because of persecution, but because it no longer inspired belief. Christianity offered an alternative. It was international, crossing borders and languages. It was egalitarian in its appeal, attracting both aristocrats and slaves. It had a clear hierarchy of bishops that mirrored the imperial bureaucracy. It promised salvation, which was more compelling than the old god's vague promises of fortune in exchange for sacrifice. Most importantly, it was growing exponentially, despite, or because of, persecution. Constantine saw in Christianity what modern analysts would call a platform, a scalable system that could integrate diverse populations under a single ideological framework. The Church could do what the legions could no longer accomplish: bind the empire together through something stronger than fear. But this utility did not preclude genuine belief. The sources suggest Constantine's faith was real, if unconventional by later Orthodox standards. He consulted bishops, studied scripture, engaged in theological debates with the passion of a convert. He seems to have believed that God had chosen him, that his victory at Milvian Bridge was divine endorsement, that his role was to unify church and state into a single Christian empire. Whether that belief was cause or consequence of his policies is a question without answer. Perhaps Constantine himself did not know where calculation ended and conviction began. He was a man of contradictions, a Christian emperor who delayed baptism until his deathbed, a patron of the Church who retained pagan priests, a defender of orthodoxy who understood theology as politics by other means. What is certain is that his policies transformed Christianity from persecuted sect to privileged institution in less than a decade. The religion that had grown in the shadows now basked in imperial favor. And with that favor came dangers the martyrs had never imagined: wealth, power, political entanglement, and the corruption that accompanies all three. Part 4. The Empire United. The rival in the East. But the empire remained divided. In the East ruled Licinius, a man of the old school, soldier, pagan, increasingly paranoid. Licinius had been Constantine's ally, bound to him through marriage and mutual interest in destroying their common enemies. In 313 AD, they had jointly issued the Edict of Milan. But alliances built on convenience dissolve when convenience changes, and by 316 AD, the two emperors were already maneuvering toward inevitable war. The first conflict came quickly. Disputes over territory in the Balkans escalated into open war. Constantine invaded Licinius's territory with the speed that had become his signature. At Cibalae and Campus Ardiensis, Constantine's forces won decisive victories. Licinius, forced to sue for peace, ceded territory, but retained his title and domain. It was an uneasy peace, the kind that exists only because both sides need time to prepare for the next round. For 7 years, Constantine and Licinius ruled their respective portions of the empire in a state of armed watchfulness. Each built armies, fortified frontiers, and issued propaganda against the other. And increasingly, the conflict took on a religious dimension. Licinius, whether from genuine pagan conviction or political calculation, began to position himself as the defender of the old religion. He removed Christians from his court and army. He reinstituted restrictions on church gatherings. His propaganda portrayed Constantine as a religious fanatic who had betrayed Rome's traditions, who had subordinated the empire to priests, who had replaced military competence with theological speculation. Constantine, in turn, portrayed Licinius as a persecutor, a tyrant who oppressed God's people, an enemy not just of Constantine, but of heaven itself. The banners of Constantine's army now bore the labarum prominently, the golden cross atop the imperial spear, draped with jewels and the monogram of Christ. To fight Constantine became, in his propaganda, to fight heaven itself. 17 centuries in Constantine's shadow at Chrysopolis. By 324 AD, war was inevitable. Both emperors had spent years preparing. Licinius commanded perhaps 150,000 infantry and 15,000 cavalry, supported by a fleet of 350 ships. Constantine's forces were somewhat smaller, but better trained and more unified in command. The opening campaign demonstrated Constantine's military genius. He advanced into Thrace, while simultaneously building a fleet to challenge Licinius's naval superiority. At Adrianople, Constantine's forces won a hard-fought battle against superior numbers. Licinius retreated to Byzantium, the strategic city that controlled the narrow strait between Europe and Asia. Constantine laid siege to Byzantium, while his newly built fleet, commanded by his son Crispus, engaged Licinius's navy in the Hellespont. In a brilliant naval victory, Crispus destroyed Licinius's fleet, cutting off his retreat and supply lines. Licinius fled across to Asia, to the city of Chrysopolis, directly across the Bosporus from Byzantium. There, on September 18, 324 AD, the decisive battle occurred. Constantine's forces crossed the Bosporus under the protection of their fleet. The two armies met on the plains of Chrysopolis. Constantine personally led the attack, the labarum carried before him like a weapon of faith. His soldiers, many of them now convinced that God fought on their side, charged with the confidence of men who believed heaven itself had enlisted in their cause. Licinius's army, demoralized by defeats and desertions, broke. The battle ended by evening, the ground dark with blood. The sign of the cross glittered among the standards. Licinius fled again, this time with nowhere left to go. He surrendered at Nicaea, the same city where Constantine had spent his youth as a hostage prince. Constantine granted him mercy. He could live, but only in retirement, stripped of power and wealth. Licinius accepted. He had no choice. Within a year, Constantine ordered him strangled. The official charge was conspiracy to rebel. The actual reason was older than Rome. Two emperors cannot share one empire indefinitely. One must die so the other can rule securely. It was a Roman solution to a Roman problem executed with Roman pragmatism. The first Christian emperor had triumphed in the old Roman way, through calculated mercy followed by necessary murder. The empire was won again for the first time in decades, united under a single ruler who claimed authority from both military victory and divine sanction. But the empire Constantine united was forever changed. The final war between Constantine and Licinius had been framed by both sides as a war between the old gods and the new. Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun. Rome's final attempt to create a universal pagan deity had faced the cross, and the cross had won. The priests of Jupiter and Mars and Venus watched and wondered when Constantine would come for them. The answer was, he wouldn't. Not yet. Constantine understood that forced conversion creates martyrs, and martyrs create resistance. The old gods would die slowly, of neglect and defunding and diminishing prestige, not in a single purge, but die they would. Constantine had crowned Christ, and the old god's time was ending. Part 5. The New Rome. The vision of a new capital. For centuries, Rome had been the sacred center of civilization, the eternal city, the place where all roads led and from which all authority flowed. To leave it was almost heresy, a rejection of 1,000 years of tradition. Constantine saw what others would not, that the heart of the world was dying from nostalgia. Rome's senators worshipped the past because they had no future. The city's economy was sustained not by production, but by tribute from provinces that resented supporting aristocrats who contributed nothing. Its streets were filled with ruins, repurposed as monuments to memory. The Senate was a hollow shell of its republican glory, a collection of wealthy men whose debates on precedence and privilege were irrelevant to an empire governed by military force and bureaucratic decree. The empire's lifeblood no longer flowed through Rome. It flowed along the eastern frontiers, the Danube, where barbarian pressure was constant, the Euphrates, where Persian armies threatened, the great trade routes that connected the Mediterranean to the riches of India and China. The wealth of the empire came from Egypt's grain, Syria's merchants, Asia Minor's cities, not from Italy's declining agriculture and decaying infrastructure. Constantine understood geography as destiny. He looked eastward to a small Greek port called Byzantium, lying on a narrow strait where Europe met Asia, where the Black Sea flowed into the Mediterranean, where three continents came together in a point of almost absurd strategic significance. From this single location, the Bosporus Strait could be controlled. Ships from the Black Sea must pass through it. Armies moving between continents must cross it or sail around it. Trade from Asia flowing westward moved through its markets. It was defensible, prosperous, positioned at the intersection of the empire's most vital regions. He chose it. He rebuilt it. He renamed it Nova Roma, New Rome, though the world would soon call it simply Constantinople, the city of Constantine. Raising the Queen of Cities. The construction of Constantinople was one of history's great acts of urban planning and imperial will. Constantine brought the full resources of the empire to bear on transforming a modest Greek trading city into a capital worthy of a new Christian empire. The project began in 324 AD, immediately after Constantine's victory over Licinius. He personally traced the city's boundaries with a spear, walking in a great arc that encompassed 7 hills, deliberately echoing Rome's 7 hills, making the symbolic connection explicit. When his advisors questioned how far he intended to extend the walls, Constantine reportedly replied, "Until he who walks before me thinks it proper to stop." Whether the story is true or propaganda, it captures Constantine's genius for theatrical piety. He presented the city not as his personal project, but as a divine commission, himself merely the instrument of God's will. Every stone laid became an act of devotion, every building a prayer in architecture. The scale was staggering. Constantine ordered the construction of city walls that would enclose an area 4 times the size of old Byzantium. These were not mere fortifications, but engineering marvels, triple-layered walls that would, in their later medieval form, protect the city for 1,000 years. They rose 40 feet high, thick enough for soldiers to march along their tops, studded with towers every 60 yards. Marble was stripped from across the empire and shipped to Constantinople. Columns from temples in Athens, Alexandria, and Ephesus were repurposed for Christian basilicas and public buildings. It was an act of cultural appropriation on an imperial scale, the old world's beauty conscripted to adorn the new. Constantine built a hippodrome vast enough for 100,000 spectators, directly attached to the imperial palace, so the emperor could enter directly from his residence, a symbolic fusion of imperial power and popular entertainment. The racing factions, blues and greens, would become political parties, their chariot races the outlet for public opinion in a state that had no democracy. He constructed baths to dwarf those of Caracalla in Rome, vast complexes of hot and cold pools, exercise yards, libraries, and social spaces where the city's inhabitants could gather. Clean water flowed through aqueducts built to last millennia. Wide colonnaded streets were laid out in a grid that facilitated both commerce and military movement. Palaces floated on terraces overlooking the Bosporus, their marble facades catching the morning sun, rising over Asia. The imperial complex grew to include throne rooms, private chapels, administrative offices, treasuries, and residential quarters for the thousands of servants, guards, and officials who made the empire function. At the city's heart rose a new kind of church, the first Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom. It was not the magnificent dome that would rise 3 centuries later, but it established the principle that the most magnificent building in the empire should be dedicated not to Jupiter or Mars or the deified emperor, but to the wisdom of God. Constantine filled his new capital with Christian symbols while carefully avoiding offense to pagans. He brought sacred relics from across Christendom, fragments of the true cross supposedly discovered by his mother Helena, the crown of thorns, the bones of martyrs, turning Constantinople into a repository of holiness that rivaled Jerusalem itself. But he also filled it with art, looted from pagan temples. The serpent column from Delphi, a bronze monument commemorating Greek victory over Persia 9 centuries earlier, was transported to Constantinople's hippodrome. Statues of Apollo, Aphrodite, and other gods adorned public squares, no longer worshipped but preserved as art. Their religious significance drained away, leaving only aesthetic value. This was Constantine's method: transformation through appropriation. The old world's cultural achievements would not be destroyed but absorbed, stripped of their original meaning, and repurposed for the new Christian empire. Pagan art adorned Christian halls. Classical philosophy would be preserved in monasteries. The forms of Rome would continue, but animated by a new spirit. In these 2 decades of frenzied construction, Constantine performed the greatest illusion ever achieved by a statesman. He convinced the world that Rome itself could move, that the eternal city was not a place, but an idea, and ideas can be transplanted. The birth of New Rome. On May 11th, 330 AD, Constantinople was formally dedicated. The ceremony blended Christian and pagan elements in ways that would become characteristic of Byzantine civilization. Constantine processed through the streets carrying an icon of the Virgin Mary, while his soldiers bore standards marked with the Chi. Prayers were offered in the new Hagia Sophia, but the celebration also included chariot races in the Hippodrome, public distributions of bread to the populace in the old Roman tradition, and the unveiling of statues that honored both Christian saints and classical heroes. The city received privileges that made it not merely equal to, but superior to Rome. Its Senate, initially stocked with Eastern aristocrats and loyal supporters of Constantine, was granted equal status to Rome's ancient Senate. Citizens of Constantinople received the same legal privileges as Roman citizens. The grain supply of Egypt, which had fed Rome for centuries, was redirected to Constantinople. The message was clear. The empire's center had shifted. Rome's aristocracy was horrified. Senators who had never left Italy, who measured their status by the antiquity of their family names, suddenly found themselves provincial. The shift was not merely geographical, but existential. Rome had defined itself as the center of the world for a millennium. Now it was being told it was merely one important city among others. But Constantine understood what they did not, that Rome's centrality had been dying for generations. The emperors of the 3rd century had barely visited Rome, preferring to campaign on the frontiers where the real threats and real power resided. Diocletian had governed from Nicaea, Galerius from Thessalonica, Constantius from Trier. The empire's political center had already shifted. Constantine merely made it official and permanent. Constantinople's location was brilliant. It could be supplied by sea even when besieged by land. It commanded the strait between the Black Sea and Mediterranean, collecting tariffs from every ship that passed. It was close enough to the Persian frontier to respond to threats, but far enough away to be safe from sudden invasion. It straddled the cultural divide between Greek East and Latin West, able to speak both languages and mediate between both worlds. From this new capital, Constantine could govern an empire that was rapidly becoming more Greek than Latin in culture, more Christian than pagan in religion, more Eastern than Western in economic orientation. The decision to found Constantinople was perhaps his most lasting achievement, more significant than any battle won or law promulgated. The city would endure for 11 centuries after Constantine's death. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in 476 AD, Constantinople barely noticed. It was too busy being the center of its own civilization. When Rome fell to barbarians, Constantinople flourished. When Latin Christendom fragmented in the Dark Ages, the Byzantine Empire preserved Roman law, Greek philosophy, and Christian theology. And so the empire's body remained Roman, but its soul had turned east, Greek in culture, Christian in creed, Byzantine in spirit. It would endure for over 1,000 years after the original Rome fell to dust, and in that endurance, Constantine's vision proved correct, that Rome was not a city, but an idea, and ideas, unlike cities, cannot be sacked. Part 6. The Struggle for Orthodoxy. When Christians fought Christians. But peace in the empire could not survive war within the church. The faith Constantine had legalized and enriched began to fracture along fault lines of theology that to outsiders seemed incomprehensible, but to believers touched the core of salvation itself. The crisis began in Alexandria, Egypt's great intellectual capital, where Christianity had developed a sophisticated theological tradition. Around 318 AD, a priest named Arius began teaching a doctrine that seemed to him both logical and scriptural. that Jesus Christ, though divine, was created by God, the Father, and was therefore subordinate to him. Christ was the highest of created beings, the agent through whom God created the world, worthy of worship, but not identical in essence to the Father. To Arius, this preserved monotheism, the absolute oneness of God that Christianity had inherited from Judaism. If Christ were equal to the Father in every way, wouldn't that make two gods? Better to say that Christ was divine but derivative, exalted but created, worthy of honor but not identical to the ultimate source of all being. It was a sophisticated theological position, argued with appeals to scripture and philosophical logic. It attracted followers among the educated clergy and seemed to solve certain philosophical problems about the nature of divinity. But to Arius's opponents, led by Alexander, the Bishop of Alexandria, this was heresy of the most dangerous kind. If Christ were merely a created being, even the highest created being, then he could not save humanity. Salvation required bridging the infinite gap between creator and creation, and only God himself could do that. If Christ were not fully God, then the incarnation was a noble gesture, but ultimately impotent, unable to accomplish what humans needed most: redemption from sin and death. The debate might have remained an intellectual dispute among Egyptian theologians, but Arius had a gift for communication. He wrote popular hymns that made his theology singable. He attracted followers among the urban poor as well as the educated elite. His opponents responded with equal fervor, and soon Alexandria erupted in riots. Christians fought Christians in the streets of the empire's second city. Mobs of Arians battled mobs of anti-Arians. Churches were vandalized. Bishops excommunicated each other. The violence spread from Alexandria to other eastern cities, Antioch, Caesarea, Nicaea, as clergy took sides and congregations split. Constantine, receiving reports of the growing crisis, was initially baffled. He had ended the persecution of Christians, unified them under imperial patronage, built them magnificent churches. Now they were fighting each other over what seemed to him abstruse philosophical distinctions. He wrote to both sides, urging reconciliation, calling the dispute a trifling matter that threatened to disturb the peace he had worked so hard to establish. It was perhaps the greatest miscalculation of his reign. The theological dispute was not trifling to those involved. It was everything. It concerned the nature of God, the possibility of salvation, the meaning of Christ's sacrifice. These were not abstract philosophical questions, but matters of eternal life and death. When his letters failed to calm the controversy, Constantine realized he needed a different approach. If the Church could not resolve its disputes through correspondence and local councils, then he would summon the entire Church to decide the matter once and for all. He would use imperial authority to create unity where theological argument had created only division. The emperor summons heaven to council. In 325 AD, Constantine summoned all bishops to a great council in the city of Nicaea, a pleasant town in Asia Minor near his capital of Nicaea. It would be the first ecumenical council in Christian history. The empire's Christian mind gathered into one hall, attempting to define truth by consensus. The invitations went out with imperial authority behind them. Bishops could use the imperial post system to travel, at state expense, from the farthest reaches of the empire, from Britain and Spain, from North Africa and Egypt, from Syria and Palestine, from the cities of Asia Minor and Greece. They came. Some 300 bishops arrived, along with countless priests, deacons, and assistants. Many bore the marks of the persecutions. Paphnutius of Egypt had lost an eye to Diocletian's torturers. Paul of Neocaesaria's hands had been burned with hot irons until his fingers were crippled. Others carried scars from beatings, brandings, or years in the mines. These were men who had defied Rome's might and survived. Now they gathered under the authority of Rome's emperor to decide what they believed. Constantine opened the council in person, entering the hall in full imperial regalia, purple robes, golden diadem, surrounded by guards. But he carried no sword. He seated himself among the bishops, not above them, and addressed them with deference. He called himself the bishop of those outside, meaning the shepherd of the secular realm while they shepherded souls. It was masterful political theatre. Constantine presented himself as the servant of the church, even while wielding the power to enforce its decisions. He was simultaneously inside and outside the theological debate. A Christian emperor who claimed authority from God but deferred to bishops on matters of doctrine. The debates that followed were intense and often bitter. Arius himself was present, defending his teachings with eloquence and scriptural citations. His main opponent, a young deacon from Alexandria named Athanasius, argued with fierce conviction that Christ must be fully God, of one substance, homoousios, with the Father, or else Christianity collapsed into incoherence. The arguments ranged from scriptural interpretation to Greek philosophy, from Christological formulas to the nature of divine being. Some bishops spoke of their visions and mystical experiences. Others deployed logical syllogisms. A few resorted to insults and accusations of heresy. The diversity of Christian thought, usually hidden in separate cities and regions, was now on full display. Constantine listened to weeks of debate with patience that must have been severely tested. He was a military man, accustomed to clear decisions and swift action, now forced to sit through endless theological subtleties. But he understood what was at stake: the unity of the Church, and through the Church, the unity of the Empire. Finally, after intense negotiation, arm-twisting, and the threat of imperial disfavor for those who remained obstinate, the council reached a decision. They adopted a creed, a formula of faith, declaring that Christ and God the Father were of one substance, homoousios. Christ was not created but eternally begotten, not subordinate but equal, not separate but united in essence, while distinct in person. The Nicene Creed was born. We believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of all things visible and invisible, and in one Lord Jesus Christ, the Son of God, begotten of the Father, only begotten, that is, of the substance of the Father, God of God, light of light, true God of true God, begotten not made, of one substance with the Father. It was a theological formula crafted with philosophical precision, an attempt to capture in human language a mystery that transcended language. The Christian God who was somehow both one and three, a Father who had a Son who was fully divine yet distinct, a unity of essence combined with a trinity of persons. Arius's teachings were condemned as heresy. Those who refused to sign the creed were threatened with exile. Most bishops signed, whether from conviction, exhaustion, or fear of imperial consequences. Arius himself was exiled to Illyria, his books ordered burned. Thus was born the Nicene Creed, the first attempt by the Universal Church to define orthodox belief with imperial enforcement behind it. What began as persecutions battered faith had become orthodoxy, backed by law, enforced by soldiers, and canonized by an emperor who still wavered between cross and sun, the creed that would not die. But the Council of Nicaea did not end the Arian controversy. It merely changed its nature from theological debate to political struggle. Many bishops who had signed the Nicene Creed under pressure soon had second thoughts. The term homoousios, of one substance, was philosophically problematic, not clearly biblical, and could be interpreted to erase the distinction between Father and Son entirely. A backlash developed, led by bishops who preferred more ambiguous formulations that allowed for Christ's subordination to the Father. Constantine, hoping he had settled the matter, found himself managing an ongoing crisis. Different factions produced rival councils, competing creeds, and dueling excommunications. The emperor, who had thought he could legislate theological unity, discovered that faith resists imperial decree. Ironically, in his later years, Constantine seems to have become sympathetic to modified forms of Arianism, or at least to compromise positions that softened the hard line of Nicaea. He recalled Arius from exile in 327 AD and ordered his reinstatement, though Arius died mysteriously before this could happen. Constantine also exiled Athanasius, the great defender of Nicene orthodoxy, sending him to Trier in 336 AD. The theological politics were complex, driven by personal rivalries, regional differences, and the difficulty of applying Greek philosophical categories to biblical revelation. What mattered historically was not the resolution, which would take centuries, but the precedent that the emperor had convened a church council, enforced its decrees, and claimed authority over ecclesiastical disputes. Constantine had created a new kind of power, the Christian emperor as defender of the faith, arbiter of theology, enforcer of orthodoxy. It was a fusion of sacred and secular authority that would define Byzantine civilization and create endless tensions between church and state, between spiritual authority and temporal power, between bishops who claimed to speak for God and emperors who claimed to rule by God's command. The relationship between Christianity and imperial power, barely 2 decades old, had already become deeply ambiguous, a source of strength for both church and state, but also a source of corruption, as both institutions discovered that the other's support came with strings attached. Part 7. The Darkness Within. Blood in the Palace. Great transformations demand sacrifices, and Constantine's final years were haunted by his own darkest deeds, sacrifices that stained his legacy with blood and raised questions about the depth of his Christian conversion. In 326 AD, at the height of his power, when his empire was unified and his capital rising on the Bosporus, scandal engulfed the imperial palace. The details remain murky, obscured by contradictory sources, embarrassed silences, and the reluctance of Christian historians to dwell on their patron's crimes. What is certain is this: Crispus, Constantine's eldest son, by his first wife Minervina, was executed on his father's orders. Crispus was perhaps 25 years old, brilliant, popular with the troops, and successful in battle. He had commanded Constantine's fleet in the victories over Licinius. He was Constantine's designated heir, the next generation of the dynasty Constantine was building. The charges against him remain unclear. Some sources hint at treason, at plotting against his father. Others, more darkly, suggest accusations of adultery with Fausta, Constantine's second wife and Crispus's stepmother. The ancient historians, writing decades later, speak vaguely of slander and suspicion and rage, as if embarrassed to name the accusations directly. Constantine ordered his son arrested while both were in residence at Pola on the Adriatic coast. Crispus was executed there, without public trial, by methods unspecified. It happened swiftly, with the efficiency of a purge rather than the ceremony of justice. Soon after, weeks or months later, the sources again disagree. Fausta was found dead. The official account said she died of overheating in an excessively hot bath. Less official accounts said Constantine ordered her scalded to death, boiled alive as punishment for whatever role she had played in Crispus's fate. Perhaps she had falsely accused Crispus to advance her own son's prospects. Perhaps she had been guilty of the accusations. Perhaps Constantine, learning of her deception, responded with the fury of a man who had killed his innocent son. Or perhaps the accusations against Crispus were true, and Fausta's death was unrelated coincidence or separate punishment for separate crimes. We cannot know. The palace walls kept their secrets, and Constantine's court historians had no interest in dwelling on details that complicated the image of the first Christian emperor. What we know is that Constantine, who had made Christianity the empire's favored faith, who had convened councils to define orthodox belief, who had built churches across the empire, had murdered his own wife and son. The emperor who proclaimed Christ's message of love and forgiveness had shown neither to his own family. Even his contemporaries were shocked. The pagan historian Zosimus, writing with obvious bias, claimed that Constantine sought Christian baptism precisely because Christianity offered forgiveness for sins too great for pagan priests to absolve. Christian historians scrambled to explain or minimize the killings, attributing them to court intrigue, false accusations, or the unfortunate necessities of imperial politics. Constantine's mother Helena seems to have been horrified. In the aftermath of the executions, she left for the Holy Land on a pilgrimage that might have been piety or might have been escape from a son whose actions appalled her. There she supposedly discovered the true cross, the wood on which Christ had been crucified, buried beneath a pagan temple in Jerusalem. Whether the discovery was genuine or political theater orchestrated to provide spiritual redemption for her son's crimes, it served to redirect attention from palace tragedy to holy triumph. After 326 AD, Constantine changed. He became quieter, more distant from his remaining family. His portraits grew severe, the face harder, the eyes more troubled. Perhaps he was already measuring his soul against the faith he had weaponized for political purposes. The emperor, who had redefined heaven, began to fear its justice, the God of politics and the politics of God. Yet Constantine continued to involve himself deeply in church affairs, perhaps seeking in theology the absolution he could not find in action. He commissioned the construction of churches with even greater fervor after 326 AD, as if marble and gold could compensate for blood. He wrote theological treatises that survive only in fragments, attempting to reconcile different Christian factions. He continued to arbitrate disputes between bishops, judge heresy cases, and enforce his vision of Christian unity. But his involvement in theology was always pragmatic rather than purely spiritual. Constantine needed a united church to unite his empire. He could tolerate different theological positions within Christianity as long as they didn't threaten order. What he could not tolerate was schism, violence between Christian factions, the breakdown of ecclesiastical authority. This led to paradoxes. Constantine, who had convened Nicaea to condemn Arianism, later showed sympathy to Arians when they presented themselves as moderates seeking compromise. Constantine, who was baptized and presumably believed in Christian principles, ruled with the ruthless pragmatism of a pagan emperor. Constantine, who built magnificent churches, delayed his own baptism until his deathbed. Whether from genuine humility, superstitious fear of committing sins after baptism, or political calculation that a baptized emperor would face pressure to act more Christian than was politically prudent. He remained Pontifex Maximus, the high priest of Rome's pagan religion, until his death. He continued to issue coins bearing the image of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, alongside Christian symbols. He appointed pagans to high office, consulted with pagan philosophers, and maintained the state cults, even while favoring Christianity with resources and legal privileges. This ambiguity was intentional. Constantine ruled an empire that was perhaps 20% Christian by 330 AD, maybe 30% by his death in 337 AD. The vast majority of his subjects, especially in the West and in rural areas, remained pagan. To force conversion would risk revolt. To abandon paganism entirely would alienate the aristocracy, the army's officer corps, and the empire's cultural elite. So Constantine created a hybrid, a Christian empire that tolerated paganism, an imperial church that maintained pagan forms, a theological orthodoxy enforced by an emperor who kept one foot in both worlds. It was an unstable synthesis, but it worked long enough for Christianity to gain demographic and institutional dominance. By the time his sons were less tactful about their Christian identity, Christianity was strong enough to survive the transition. The war that never came. Constantine's final years were spent preparing for a war he would never fight. The Persian Empire under the Sassanid dynasty had been Rome's great rival for centuries, the only power that could challenge Roman military might on equal terms. The frontier between Rome and Persia in Mesopotamia was a zone of perpetual tension, occasional war, and expensive fortification. By 336 AD, tensions were rising again. The Persian king Shapur II was expanding westward, threatening Rome's client states. Constantine began assembling a massive army for an invasion of Persia, a campaign that would exceed even Alexander the Great's conquest 3 centuries earlier. It was to be the crowning achievement of his military career, the conquest of Persia, the expansion of Christian empire to the borders of India, the fulfillment of Alexander's dream under the banner of the cross. Constantine was now in his 60s, but his ambition remained boundless. He would succeed where Marcus Aurelius, Septimius Severus, and a dozen other emperors had failed. He would bring Persia into the Roman orbit, convert its population, and create a Christian empire stretching from Britain to Babylon. But he never left Constantinople. In early 337 AD, while preparing for the Persian campaign, Constantine fell ill. The sources describe a fever, weakness, difficulty breathing, symptoms that could indicate many diseases. He sought treatment at the hot springs of Helenopolis, named for his mother, who had died a decade earlier. The waters did not heal him. Realizing death was approaching, Constantine made his final preparations with the methodical care he had brought to every challenge. He divided the empire among his 3 surviving sons, Constantine II, Constantius II, and Constans. He hoped they would rule as colleagues, maintaining the unity he had forged. They would instead spend years fighting each other for supremacy. But Constantine could not know that. The final sacrament. He summoned bishops to his bedside, and there finally, with death inevitable and time running out, Constantine requested baptism. This was the moment Christian historians had been waiting for, the final proof of Constantine's faith. He who had made Christianity legal, who had convened councils and built churches and claimed divine guidance, had delayed the sacrament until the very end. Why? The most charitable interpretation is theological. Baptism washed away all sins, so delaying it until death ensured entering heaven in a state of grace, with no time to accumulate new sins. This was not uncommon practice in the early church, when the standards for Christian behavior were extremely high, and the concept of repeated forgiveness less developed than it would become. The less charitable interpretation is that Constantine wanted to rule as a Roman emperor, with all the violence, pragmatism, and moral compromise that entailed, without facing Christian moral constraints. Once baptized, he would be expected to forgive enemies, renounce violence, live according to teachings that were impossible for a ruler of a vast, threatened empire. So he delayed, maintaining the option of ruthlessness until the moment when he no longer needed it. The truth, as always with Constantine, likely lies somewhere between calculation and conviction, between political genius and genuine spiritual hunger. He was a man of contradictions, who never resolved them, perhaps never tried to resolve them, perhaps thought the contradiction itself was the point. Eusebius, who became Constantine's primary biographer, describes the baptism with reverential detail. Constantine laid aside the purple imperial robes and dressed in white, the garment of the newly baptized, symbolizing purity and rebirth. The pagan generals who had followed him through decades of war wept as priests prepared the water. He who had transformed an empire through force of will submitted finally to the one force he could not command, death and whatever lay beyond it. In that final moment, laying aside the purple and the sword and the Pontifex Maximus title and the weight of empire, Constantine became a Christian, not by policy, but by need, not as emperor, but as man. For the first time in his adult life, he had no power except the hope of salvation. He died a few days later, on May 22nd, 337 AD, the day of Pentecost in the Christian calendar, a coincidence that his chroniclers noted as providential. He was approximately 65 years old. He had ruled for 31 years, longer than all but a handful of emperors in Roman history. His body was placed in a sarcophagus of purple porphyry, the stone reserved for emperors, in the Church of the Holy Apostles in Constantinople. He was interred surrounded by monuments to the 12 apostles, symbolically making himself the 13th, the equal of those who had walked with Christ. It was a claim to sanctity that would have been blasphemous to earlier Christians, but seemed natural in the new world Constantine had created, where emperors convened councils and enforced creeds. The pagan generals and Christian bishops alike mourned him, though for different reasons. The pagans mourned the last emperor who had maintained some connection to Rome's traditional gods. The Christians mourned their patron, protector, and the one who had raised them from persecution to power in a single generation. And the empire paused, briefly, uncertain whether the world Constantine had created would endure without him. Epilogue. The Great Pivot. Constantine's eternal shadow. When Constantine closed his eyes on that Pentecost day in 337 AD, the world of the Caesars ended, even if the empire bearing their name would continue for centuries. The transformation he had wrought was irreversible. The empire he left no longer marched beneath the gods of Olympus, but beneath the sign of a cross. Its capital faced the sunrise, not the sunset. Its official religion preached peace while being enforced by soldiers, promised poverty while accumulating vast wealth, spoke of humility while bishops wore silk and entered palaces. From Constantine's reign would flow consequences that shaped the next millennium and continue to echo in our own age. Sons of Constantine, heirs of chaos. Constantine's three sons inherited the empire and immediately proved unequal to their father's vision. Within 3 years of his death, they had murdered most of their male relatives in a purge designed to eliminate rival claimants. The sons of Constantine's half-brothers, his nephews and cousins, were killed to prevent future civil wars, creating, in the process, trauma that guaranteed future conflicts. The empire Constantine had united fragmented again. Constantine II died fighting his brother Constans in 340 AD. Constans ruled the West until he was assassinated in 350 AD. Constantius II, the most capable of the three and the most theologically inclined, ruled the East and eventually reunified the empire, but at the cost of perpetual civil war. Yet despite this chaos, Constantine's fundamental transformation held. Christianity continued to gain adherents, resources, and political power. The church that had been illegal 2 generations earlier was now wealthy, influential, and capable of defying even emperors on theological matters. Athanasius, the great defender of Nicene orthodoxy, was exiled 5 times by emperors who found him inconvenient, but his theology ultimately triumphed. By the end of the 4th century, Christianity was not merely favored, but enforced. The Emperor Theodosius I would declare Nicene Christianity the sole legal religion in 380 AD, outlawing pagan sacrifice and closing the old temples. The transformation, Constantine began subtly, would be completed brutally by his successors. The city that outlived an empire. Constantine's new capital proved his most enduring achievement. Constantinople became what Constantine had envisioned, the nexus of empire, culture, and faith. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the late 5th century, overrun by Germanic tribes, Constantinople barely noticed. The Eastern Roman Empire, which historians would later call Byzantine, though its inhabitants always called themselves Romans, continued for another 1,000 years. From Constantinople, Byzantine emperors would preserve Roman law, Greek philosophy, and Christian theology through the chaos of the early medieval period. When Western Europe fragmented into warring kingdoms ruled by barely literate warlords, Constantinople maintained libraries, universities, hospitals, and a sophisticated bureaucracy. The city withstood sieges by Persians, Avars, Arabs, Bulgars, and Rus. Its triple walls, begun by Constantine, were expanded and strengthened, but never breached by foreign enemies for 1,000 years. It was the richest city in Christendom, the most sophisticated, the most cultured. Visitors from the West described it with awe bordering on disbelief. Its size, its wealth, its churches with golden domes and walls covered in mosaics that seemed to bring heaven to earth. Constantinople preserved the classical heritage that the West lost. When Islamic armies conquered the Middle East and North Africa, Christian refugees fled to Constantinople, bringing with them manuscripts, knowledge, and memories of the ancient world. When the empire finally fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453 AD, Greek scholars, fleeing westward, brought those manuscripts to Italy, helping to spark the Renaissance. Constantine could not have imagined this, but he had created the conditions for it. By moving the capital east, he ensured that when the West fell into darkness, a lamp remained burning that would eventually relight Europe. The Emperor's Church, the Church's Emperor. Constantine's convening of the Council of Nicaea established a precedent that shaped Christianity for centuries, that emperors had authority over theological disputes, that orthodoxy could be defined by councils and enforced by law, that Christianity and imperial power were intertwined. This fusion of church and state created both strength and corruption. Christian emperors could mobilize imperial resources to spread the faith, build churches, support clergy, send missionaries. But they could also manipulate theology for political purposes, appoint and depose bishops, turn theological disputes into matters of state security. The model Constantine created, Caesaropapism, the emperor as head of both state and church, became characteristic of Byzantine Christianity and later of Russian Orthodoxy. The emperor was the viceroy of God on earth, responsible for both the empire's security and its subjects' souls. This differed fundamentally from the Western model that would develop, where popes claimed authority independent of and superior to kings. The Arian controversy that Constantine tried to resolve at Nicaea continued for decades. In a supreme irony, many of the Germanic tribes that would conquer the Western Roman Empire converted to Arian Christianity rather than Nicene orthodoxy. The Goths, Vandals, and Lombards who overran Rome and Italy were Christians, but heretical Christians by the empire's standards, creating new conflicts that would take centuries to resolve. Yet the Nicene Creed Constantine enforced became the foundation of Christian orthodoxy. With minor modifications, it is still recited in Catholic, Orthodox, and many Protestant churches today, one of the few things uniting Christians across denominational divides. Every Sunday, billions of Christians across the world recite words whose authoritative form was established at a council convened by a Roman emperor 16 centuries ago. Saint or sinner? The impossible question. Constantine's legacy has always been morally complicated. He was a man who claimed Christian faith while maintaining pagan practices, who preached mercy while ruling through violence, who built churches with one hand while killing family members with the other. Christian historians, from Eusebius onward, have struggled with this ambiguity. Eusebius portrayed Constantine as a saint, God's chosen instrument to establish Christian empire, guided by divine visions and inspired by heavenly wisdom. He minimized or omitted Constantine's darker acts, the execution of Crispus and Fausta, the murder of Licinius, despite promises of mercy, the brutality of his military campaigns. Later, historians have been less forgiving. Edward Gibbon, writing in the 18th century, saw Constantine as a calculating politician who used Christianity for personal advantage, whose conversion was strategic rather than sincere, whose legacy was the corruption of a pure faith by imperial power. Modern historians tend toward ambivalence, seeing Constantine as a man of his time who cannot be judged by standards that did not exist in the 4th century. He was violent, but so were all Roman emperors. The violence was structural to the office. He was ambitious, but ambition built the empire. He was politically calculating in his religious policy, but also appears to have genuinely believed in divine favor and Christian truth, insofar as he understood it. What remains indisputable is his historical importance. Constantine did not make Christianity true or false. Those are theological questions beyond historical judgment. But he made Christianity powerful, and power changes everything it touches. Before Constantine, Christianity was a persecuted minority faith, growing despite opposition, defined by martyrdom and moral witness. After Constantine, it was an imperial religion, backed by state resources and enforced by law, capable of building magnificent churches but also capable of persecuting those it deemed heretics. The question that haunts Constantine's legacy is whether this was Christianity's triumph or its corruption. Did Constantine save the Church by ending persecution and providing resources for growth? Or did he corrupt it by entangling it with imperial power, replacing spiritual authority with political coercion, transforming a religion of the cross into a religion of the sword? The answer depends on which version of Christianity one believes is authentic. For those who see the Church as necessarily institutional, hierarchical, and engaged with worldly power, Constantine was a savior. For those who see authentic Christianity as countercultural, non-violent, and separate from state power, Constantine was a catastrophe. Both versions have existed within Christianity ever since, in constant tension. The Church of bishops and emperors versus the Church of monks and martyrs, institutional Christianity versus mystical Christianity, orthodoxy enforced by councils versus personal faith experienced in prayer. Constantine created this tension. Before him, Christianity was too weak and persecuted to face such questions. After him, they became unavoidable. Rome, Greece, and Christ. The threefold synthesis. The civilization Constantine founded, Byzantine Christianity, represented a unique fusion of elements that would have seemed incompatible to earlier ages. It was Roman in its legal structures, maintaining the empire's commitment to written law, rational administration, and universal citizenship. The Corpus Juris Civilis, the great compilation of Roman law completed under Justinian in the 6th century, drew directly on Constantine's legal innovations and preserved Roman jurisprudence for the medieval world. It was Greek in its language and high culture. By Constantine's death, Greek had already replaced Latin as the empire's common language in the East. Byzantine scholars preserved Greek philosophy, literature, and science through the medieval period when the West had forgotten Greek entirely. Plato, Aristotle, Euclid, and Ptolemy survived in Byzantine manuscripts. It was Christian in its ultimate identity and purpose. The Byzantine Empire saw itself as God's kingdom on earth, the Christian empire that would endure until Christ's return. Its emperors were not merely political leaders, but sacred figures. Their authority derived from God, their duty to defend orthodoxy as important as defending borders. This synthesis created a civilization of remarkable resilience and sophistication. Byzantine art developed the icon tradition, stylized sacred images that were windows into divine reality. Byzantine architecture perfected the dome, creating vast churches like Justinian's Hagia Sophia that seemed to float on light. Byzantine theology grappled with the deepest questions of Christian doctrine, producing a rich tradition of mystical thought. The empire Constantine founded survived catastrophes that would have destroyed lesser civilizations. In the 7th century, it lost 2/3 of its territory to Islamic conquest. Syria, Palestine, Egypt, North Africa, yet Constantinople endured. In the 11th century, it lost most of Asia Minor to the Seljuk Turks, yet it recovered. In 1204, it was actually conquered by crusaders from the West, who sacked Constantinople with a brutality that exceeded anything inflicted by Muslim armies. Yet the Byzantine state reconstituted itself and reclaimed its capital in 1261. For over 1,000 years after Constantine's death, the Byzantine Empire stood as a bulwark against invasion from the east, absorbing attacks that would otherwise have struck Western Europe. When Constantinople finally fell in 1453, the shock waves reached across Christendom. The lamp Constantine had lit had finally been extinguished. Yet even in defeat, Byzantine culture proved its vitality. The Ottoman Empire that conquered Constantinople absorbed many Byzantine administrative practices. Greek scholars fleeing to Italy brought manuscripts and knowledge that helped ignite the Renaissance. Byzantine Christianity lived on in Russia, where Moscow proclaimed itself the Third Rome, successor to Constantinople as the protector of orthodoxy. How Constantine conquered the West after death. Constantine's impact on the Western Roman Empire was equally profound, though it played out differently. The Western provinces were always poorer, less urbanized, more threatened by barbarian invasion than the East. Constantine's decision to move the capital eastward, while strategically brilliant, essentially abandoned the West to its own devices. Yet Christianity in the West developed its own distinctive character, shaped partly by Constantine's legacy and partly by resistance to it. The Bishop of Rome, the Pope, claimed authority independent of imperial control, based on succession from St. Peter. When Western emperors were too weak to convene councils or enforce orthodoxy, popes filled the vacuum. This created a different model of church-state relations. In Byzantium, the emperor was supreme over both realms. In the West, popes and kings competed for authority, neither able to dominate completely, creating a tension that would define medieval European politics. The conversion of the Germanic tribes that conquered the Western Empire owed much to Constantine's precedent. When Clovis, king of the Franks, converted to Christianity around 496 AD, he was following Constantine's model, a military leader seeking divine sanction and ecclesiastical support for his rule. The baptism of Clovis was deliberately staged to echo Constantine's vision, complete with claims of miraculous signs. Similarly, when Charlemagne was crowned Holy Roman Emperor by Pope Leo III on Christmas Day, 800 AD, it was an attempt to recreate Constantine's fusion of imperial power and Christian authority in the West. Charlemagne saw himself as a second Constantine, restoring Christian empire after centuries of fragmentation. The entire medieval concept of Christendom, the idea that Europe was a single civilization united by Christian faith, even if divided politically, derived from Constantine's vision of Christian empire. The Crusades, launched to reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim control, were framed in Constantinian terms. Christian emperors and kings leading holy war under the sign of the cross. Even the negative aspects of medieval Christianity, religious intolerance, the Inquisition, persecution of heretics and Jews, had precedence in Constantine's reign. He had established the principle that the state should enforce religious orthodoxy, that heresy was not merely theological error, but political crime, that Christian rulers had a duty to suppress wrong belief. The Protestant Reformation of the 16th century was, in part, a reaction against Constantinian Christianity. Reformers like Martin Luther attacked the wealth and worldly power of the Church, calling for a return to simpler, more authentic faith. Yet even Protestant rulers followed Constantine's model, claiming authority over churches in their territories, convening councils to define doctrine, and enforcing religious uniformity through state power. Constantine's shadow fell across both Catholic and Protestant Christianity, shaping how Christians understood the relationship between faith and power, church and state, spiritual authority and temporal rule, from movement to monument. Perhaps Constantine's most lasting impact was transforming Christianity from a movement into an institution. The early church had been charismatic, decentralized, diverse. Different cities and regions had different practices, different interpretations of Scripture, different forms of organization. Unity came from shared belief in Christ's resurrection and a loose network of communication among bishops, not from central authority. Constantine's patronage required organization. Imperial funds needed proper accounting. Legal privileges required clear definitions of who counted as clergy. Theological disputes that threatened public order required authoritative resolution. The church that had survived through voluntary association now needed to function as part of the imperial apparatus. The result was bureaucratization. Bishops became administrators, managing property and staff. Councils became legislatures, producing canons that functioned as church law. Theological disputes became legal proceedings, with formal charges, defenses, and verdicts enforced by imperial power. This was both necessary and corrupting. Necessary because a church of millions requires organization that a church of thousands does not. Corrupting because bureaucracy tends toward self-preservation, power tends toward abuse, and wealth tends toward luxury that contradicts Christian teaching. The monastic movement, which exploded in the 4th and 5th centuries, was partly a reaction against Constantine's church. Monks fled to the desert, seeking the authentic Christian life they believed was impossible in cities where bishops lived in palaces. St. Anthony, St. Pachomius, and other desert fathers represented Christianity's countercultural witness, maintained by those who rejected the Constantinian synthesis. Yet even monasticism eventually became institutionalized, organized into orders with rules and hierarchies, supported by endowments and imperial patronage. There was no escaping the transformation Constantine had wrought. Believer, cynic, or both. The question of Constantine's personal sincerity has occupied scholars for 17 centuries. Was he a genuine believer or a cynical manipulator? Did he truly experience a vision at the Milvian Bridge or fabricate it for political advantage? Was his deathbed baptism authentic spiritual hunger or final insurance policy? The question may be unanswerable, but perhaps it is also the wrong question. Constantine lived in a world where the boundaries between sincere belief and political calculation were not clearly drawn, where religious experience and strategic thinking were not opposites, but complements. Ancient rulers were expected to maintain relationships with the divine through proper ritual. They consulted omens before battles, sacrificed to gods for victory, claimed divine favor for their reigns. Constantine did the same, but with the Christian God instead of Jupiter and Mars. His religious practice was thoroughly Roman in its pragmatism, but the object of devotion was new. The vision at the Milvian Bridge, whether subjective religious experience or calculated propaganda, clearly mattered to Constantine. He referenced it repeatedly throughout his life. He had the Chi symbol placed on his military standards, coinage, and monuments. He told the story to Eusebius decades later, when there was no political advantage to fabricating it. Yet Constantine also retained the title Pontifex Maximus and continued to issue coins with solar imagery. He executed family members who threatened his rule. He ruled with the brutality characteristic of successful Roman emperors. His Christianity, if genuine, did not make him less violent or more merciful by the standards of Christian ethics. Perhaps the most accurate assessment is that Constantine's faith was real, but thoroughly embedded in imperial concerns. He believed God had chosen him to rule and transform the empire. He believed Christianity was true and its God powerful. But he also believed that a ruler must do what was necessary to maintain power, that divine favor required human effort, that God helps those who help themselves through strategic calculation and military might. This fusion of faith and realpolitik would characterize Byzantine Christianity for 1,000 years. Byzantine emperors were sincerely pious and ruthlessly pragmatic, without seeing any contradiction between the two. The hinge of history. To understand Constantine's significance, imagine two counterfactual histories. In the first alternative, Constantine loses at the Milvian Bridge. Maxentius remains emperor of the West. Perhaps Licinius eventually defeats Constantine, or perhaps the civil wars continue indefinitely. Without imperial patronage, Christianity continues to grow, but remains a minority religion, facing periodic persecution depending on which emperor holds power. Perhaps by the 6th or 7th century, Christianity becomes the majority faith through gradual conversion. But without the resources and institutional development Constantine provided. The medieval church is weaker, less organized, less able to preserve classical learning or convert barbarian tribes. European civilization develops differently, perhaps more fragmented, perhaps less literate, perhaps more vulnerable to Islamic conquest in the 8th century. In the second alternative, Constantine wins but does not convert. He remains a devoted worshipper of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, and tries to unify the empire around solar monotheism. Christianity faces renewed persecution under Constantine and his successors. Perhaps it survives as a minority sect. Perhaps it splinters into regional churches without imperial councils to enforce unity. Perhaps it dies out entirely, unable to withstand sustained persecution by a strong emperor. In this timeline, Europe's dominant religion might be Reformed paganism or Mithraism, or some syncretic faith blending various traditions. Neither alternative is implausible. The Milvian Bridge was a close-fought battle. Constantine's conversion was not inevitable. Other emperors had risen to power without adopting Christianity. The pivot could have turned differently, but it didn't. Constantine won, converted, and transformed the empire. And because the Roman Empire was the organizing structure of the Western world, its religious transformation reshaped civilization. From Constantine's reign flowed consequences that included the Byzantine Empire preserving classical culture through the Dark Ages, the conversion of Europe to Christianity, the development of canon law and its influence on Western legal systems, the building of countless churches, monasteries, and cathedrals that defined medieval architecture, the development of Christian theology and philosophy that shaped Western thought, the concept of Christendom that united Europe culturally even when politically divided, the Crusades and religious warfare between Christianity and Islam, the tensions between church and state that defined medieval politics, and ultimately, through reaction and reformation, the development of secularism and religious pluralism in the modern West. Every one of these developments traced back, directly or indirectly, to Constantine's decision to embrace Christianity and make it the favored religion of the Roman Empire. The pivot was real. The old world ended. A new world began. The cross and the sword. An unresolved marriage. Constantine embodied a paradox that Christianity has never fully resolved. The relationship between spiritual truth and worldly power. Jesus of Nazareth was crucified by the Roman Empire as a political rebel. The early Christians were persecuted by Roman authorities for refusing to sacrifice to the emperor. Christianity began as a religion of the powerless, promising that the last would be first, that the meek would inherit the earth, that God sided with the poor and marginalized against the rich and powerful. 3 centuries later, The Roman emperor was Christian, the church was wealthy, and bishops held political power. Had Christianity conquered the empire, or had the empire conquered Christianity? The question admits no simple answer. On one hand, Christianity genuinely transformed the empire's values over time. The gladiatorial games, where men fought to death for entertainment, were eventually abolished. Infanticide and exposure of unwanted children declined. Charity toward the poor became an expected virtue. The status of women improved marginally. Slavery continued, but was somewhat ameliorated by Christian teaching that masters and slaves were equal before God. On the other hand, the Church adopted many imperial practices and values. Bishops dressed like senators, governed like magistrates, and accumulated wealth like aristocrats. Theological disputes were settled through councils that functioned like legislative assemblies, with voting, factions, and political maneuvering. Heretics were persecuted with the same methods once used against Christians. The faith that had been spread by unarmed missionaries was now advanced by emperors leading armies. Constantine's legacy is this unresolved tension. He made Christianity powerful, and Christians have been struggling ever since with whether that was ultimately good or bad, whether power can be used for holy purposes or whether it inevitably corrupts, whether the Church should partner with the state or stand apart from it. Different Christian traditions have answered these questions differently. Eastern Orthodoxy largely embraced the Byzantine model of church-state symphony, seeing no contradiction between Christian faith and imperial power. Roman Catholicism developed a more independent papacy that claimed spiritual authority over temporal rulers. Protestant reformers emphasized individual faith over institutional power, but often created their own state churches. Modern Christianity includes traditions that range from total rejection of worldly power to active pursuit of political influence. All of these positions are arguing in one way or another with Constantine's ghost. His fusion of Christianity and empire created the problem that Christians have been trying to solve ever since. The transformation left incomplete. Constantine's revolution was incomplete. He made Christianity legal and favored, but not mandatory. He built churches, but did not destroy temples. He convened councils, but did not impose a single theology by force. He was baptized only on his deathbed. This incompleteness was partly strategic. Forcing religious transformation would have risked civil war. But it also reflected genuine uncertainty about how far the transformation should go. Constantine was creating something new, without clear precedent or blueprint. He was improvising Christian empire as he went, borrowing from both Roman and Christian traditions, but fully adhering to neither. His sons were less subtle. Constantine II, Constantius II, and Constans moved more aggressively against paganism, closing temples and banning sacrifices in some regions. Constantius II strongly favored Arian Christianity, exiling bishops who disagreed. The pendulum swung back briefly under Julian the Apostate, 361 to 363 AD, Constantine's nephew, who tried to restore paganism and marginalize Christianity. But Julian's early death ended that experiment. By the end of the 4th century, under Theodosius I, Christianity became the only legal religion. Pagan temples were ordered closed, sacrifices forbidden, heresy punishable by law. The transformation Constantine began subtly was completed coercively by his successors. Yet even then, the revolution remained incomplete. Paganism survived in rural areas. The word pagan comes from paganus, meaning country dweller, well into the 6th century. Folk practices blending Christian and pre-Christian elements continued indefinitely. The old gods were not destroyed. They were transformed into saints, demons, or folklore, their power drained, but their memory preserved. The incompleteness of Constantine's revolution suggests that cultural transformation is never total, never final. Every revolution carries within it elements of what it displaced. Byzantine Christianity, for all its newness, preserved classical philosophy, Roman law, and Greek culture. Medieval Christianity incorporated pagan festivals, adapted local traditions, and created a synthesis that would have seemed foreign to both early Christians and classical pagans. Constantine did not destroy the ancient world so much as transform it, fold it into something new. And perhaps that is the most accurate way to understand his achievement, not as ending one civilization and beginning another, but as engineering the greatest act of cultural synthesis in Western history. Conclusion: the weight of empire and the shadow of the cross. When we look back across 17 centuries at Constantine, we see a figure who defies simple judgment, who embodies contradictions that still shape our world. He was a warrior emperor who claimed to follow the Prince of Peace, a political genius who experienced religious visions, a murderer who built churches, a pagan who died a Christian, a Roman who looked eastward, a traditionalist who revolutionized everything he touched. He killed his own son and wife, yet claimed divine favor. He ended the persecution of Christians, then persecuted heretics. He preached Christian love while waging ruthless war. He spoke of humility while building monuments to his own glory. He was baptized only when death was certain, but he had shaped Christianity's destiny for decades before that final sacrament. We cannot reconcile these contradictions because Constantine never did. He was not a saint, despite later Orthodox veneration. He was not a cynical manipulator, despite some historians' portrayals. He was a man of his age who seized opportunities others missed, who saw possibilities others couldn't imagine, who had the vision and ruthlessness to transform the world's largest empire in a single generation. The Milvian Bridge, where Constantine claimed heaven spoke to him, was not the largest or most strategically important battle in Roman history, but it was the pivot. Before it, Christianity was a persecuted minority faith. After it, Christianity was on the path to becoming Europe's defining religion and Western civilization's core identity for over 1,000 years. Constantinople, the city Constantine founded on an obscure Greek port, would become the richest, most sophisticated city in Christendom, preserving civilization through the Dark Ages and standing as a bulwark against invasion for 11 centuries. When it finally fell, in 1453, the Renaissance was already dawning in Italy, sparked partly by Byzantine scholars fleeing westward with the classical manuscripts Constantinople had preserved. The Council of Nicaea, which Constantine convened to resolve theological disputes, established precedents for how Christianity would define orthodoxy and deal with heresy for millennia. The Nicene Creed is still recited by billions of Christians. The model of emperor convening councils shaped Byzantine and later Russian Christianity. The idea that the state should enforce religious orthodoxy influenced European politics until the Enlightenment, and still echoes in contemporary debates about religion's role in public life. Constantine's decision to embrace Christianity, whatever his motives, determined that European civilization would be Christian. This shaped everything that followed: the medieval church, the university system, Western philosophy, art and architecture, legal traditions, social welfare concepts, attitudes toward poverty and wealth, the Crusades, the Inquisition, the Reformation, the Counter-Reformation, the wars of religion, and eventually the secular reaction against religious authority. We cannot understand the West without understanding Constantine. The Europe that emerged from the Middle Ages, the Western civilization that spread across the globe through colonization and cultural influence, the modern world with its peculiar fusion of Christian ethics and Roman law, secular governance, and religious heritage. All of this traces back to choices Constantine made 17 centuries ago. The two empires. In the end, Constantine created two empires, not one. The first was political. The Roman Empire reorganized, with its capital at Constantinople, its official religion Christianity, its future tilted eastward. This empire endured for 1,000 years in the east, became the Byzantine Empire in historical terminology, and finally fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. But even in falling, it had preserved Roman law, Greek learning, and Christian theology through centuries when Western Europe descended into illiteracy and fragmentation. The Second Empire was cultural and spiritual. Christendom. The idea that all Christians belong to a single civilization, united by shared faith, whatever their political divisions. This empire had no formal boundaries, no emperor in any conventional sense, but it was real nonetheless. It shaped medieval Europe's self-understanding, justified the Crusades, created a common intellectual culture among educated elites who could all read Latin, and persisted in various forms until the modern age shattered it into nation-states and competing ideologies. Constantine founded both empires. The political one is dead. The cultural one transformed beyond recognition. But both shaped the world we inhabit. The burden of victory. There is a tragedy embedded in Constantine's triumph. Christianity won imperial favor and survived to reshape civilization. But in winning, it lost something essential to its original character. The Christianity that Constantine embraced was already 3 centuries old, shaped by persecution and minority status. It had developed a fierce commitment to truth, regardless of consequences, a willingness to die for beliefs, a suspicion of worldly power, and a radical ethic of love and forgiveness that challenged Roman values. The Christianity that emerged from Constantine's reign was different. It had wealth and power. It could build magnificent buildings and support thousands of clergy. It could influence law and policy. It could enforce orthodoxy and punish heretics. But it struggled to maintain the moral witness that had characterized the persecuted church. Monks fled to the desert because they believed authentic Christianity was impossible in cities where bishops wore silk. Reformers across the centuries would call for return to primitive simplicity. The tension between the Church of Power and the Church of Witness became permanent, built into Christianity's DNA by Constantine's transformation. Was the trade-off worth it? Would Christianity have died out without imperial patronage, unable to withstand sustained persecution? Or would it have flourished better as a countercultural movement, maintaining moral authority by refusing worldly power? We cannot know. History offers no controlled experiments. Constantine made his choice. Christianity accepted his patronage, and both were forever changed by the transaction. The man who contained multitudes. Strip away the hagiography and propaganda, the legends and the lies, and what remains? A man born in uncertain circumstances who rose to supreme power through military genius and political skill. A son who murdered his father's legacy by transforming everything his father built. A husband who killed his wife, a father who executed his son, a convert whose faith was real but never simple, never pure, always entangled with ambition and strategy, a ruler who saw possibilities others missed, that Christianity could unify what paganism no longer could, that the empire's center must shift eastward to survive, that councils could define truth and enforce unity, that symbols matter as much as soldiers, that the empire could be reimagined without being destroyed. A visionary who claimed to see crosses in the sky and may have genuinely believed his own propaganda, or a calculating genius who understood the power of religious conviction and harnessed it for political purposes, or most likely both at once, inextricably fused in a personality that never separated faith from ambition, because he saw no reason they should be separate. Constantine was not a good man by Christian standards. He was not even a good man by Roman standards, which tolerated brutality but valued certain virtues, clemency, magnanimity, keeping one's word, that Constantine violated. He was a successful emperor by the ruthless standards of the 4th century, when success meant survival, and survival required eliminating threats before they eliminated you. Yet this flawed, violent, calculating man changed the world more profoundly than almost anyone else in history. Not through virtue, but through vision. Not through holiness, but through understanding what others did not, that the old world was dying, and something new could be built from its remains. The moment that changed everything. The great pivot, the turn from ancient to medieval, from pagan to Christian, from Rome facing west to Constantinople facing east, was not a single moment, but a process. It began before Constantine and continued after him. But he was its fulcrum, the point on which everything turned. Before Constantine, Christianity's future was uncertain. It was growing, but facing periodic persecution. It had no legal status, no property rights, no political influence. It could have remained a minority religion, like Judaism. It could have been crushed by a more systematic persecution than Diocletian's. It could have fragmented into competing sects without councils to enforce unity. After Constantine, Christianity's dominance was practically inevitable. It had imperial patronage, legal privileges, vast resources. Temples were being converted to churches. Bishops were becoming political powers. The momentum Constantine created would carry Christianity to dominance, even through periods when emperors were less supportive. The pivot was not complete when Constantine died. The empire was not yet fully Christian. The old gods still had their worshippers, their temples, their defenders. Theological disputes continued indefinitely, but the direction was set. The old gods would die slowly. Christ would reign. And in that transformation, the ancient world, the world of Homer and Virgil, of Plato and Cicero, of Jupiter and Mars, of city-states and classical philosophy, of gladiators and public sacrifice, of citizenship as the highest identity, that world ended. In its place emerged medieval Christendom, the world of monks and bishops, of pilgrimages and relics, of Romanesque cathedrals and Byzantine mosaics, of theological disputation and crusading zeal, of faith as the organizing principle of civilization, of salvation as humanity's highest concern. Constantine did not single-handedly create this new world, but he was its architect. He drew the plans, laid the foundations, and began the construction. Others would complete it, but they built on ground he had prepared. He killed the old gods, not with sword or decree, but by building a new world where they had no place. And he crowned Christ, not merely with words, but with gold, marble, and the full weight of imperial power. The final reckoning. 17 centuries later, we still live in the world Constantine made, though it has been transformed beyond anything he could imagine. The Christianity he empowered has split into thousands of denominations, spread to every continent, shaped and been shaped by countless cultures. The empire he ruled is dust. The city he founded is now Istanbul, a secular metropolis in a Muslim-majority country. The councils he convened are history, though their creeds endure. Yet Constantine's fundamental achievement remains. He demonstrated that civilizations can be transformed from within, that religious change can reshape politics and culture, that empires can survive revolution by adapting rather than resisting, that the cross and the sword can coexist even if they should not. For good and ill, Constantine's legacy persists. Every time church and state collaborate or conflict, we revisit questions he first confronted. Every time Christianity grapples with wealth and power, we echo debates that began in his reign. Every time we wonder whether faith can guide politics without corrupting both, we wrestle with Constantine's ghost. He was not the last word on any of these questions, but he was the first emperor to ask them, and his answers shaped a millennium of history. Constantine was warrior and priest, skeptic and mystic, tyrant and visionary. He murdered his kin and sanctified his empire. He blended the sun of Sol Invictus with the light of Christ and proclaimed them one. He executed heretics in the name of a crucified God. He built churches with taxes collected by torture. He claimed divine guidance while plotting political strategy. He was a man of blood who prayed to the Prince of Peace. He killed the old gods, not with violence, but with indifference, building a world where they became irrelevant. And he crowned Christ not merely with words, but with the full apparatus of imperial power, gold, marble, armies, and law. And in his contradiction, the ancient world was buried, and the Middle Ages were born. The old gods fell silent, their temples emptied, their altars cold. Christ spoke through an emperor's ambition, and history once again was remade in the image of fire and faith. Constantine had killed the old gods and crowned Christ. The world would never be the same. The end.